Okay, evening everyone. So tonight we're going to be picking up our series on parables in the Gospel of Luke. And we've explored over the last few weeks how Jesus uses parables, short stories, to challenge the social, the cultural, and the religious norms of his day, and to teach the gospel message throughout the different places that he traveled and the different people that he came across. And of course, those parables are just as much for us today as they were for the original audience who heard them 2,000 years ago in Israel. Well, tonight we're looking at a tale of two people with contrasting positions in society and with two contrasting responses to Jesus. And this is a story that starts with an invitation. There's this guy called Simon, he's a Pharisee, and he invites Jesus to dinner. And I want us tonight to really put ourselves at this dinner party. We're going to imagine that we were there. And we're going to walk through this scene and the characters that we come across as we try and understand what God wants to put on our hearts tonight. So let's just look at verse 36. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. Now, this dinner party would have been a fairly big deal, attended by many other respectable people among society, quite possibly other Pharisees and other Jewish leaders. These were events that were laced with cultural formalities, and as a host, it was your role to show everybody how great you were, how respectable you were, or even how superior you were among your community. And this display wouldn't just have been for guests with invites. In fact, the people walking past on the street, the wider public, they would walk past and look through the windows and the doorways, which wouldn't have been covered up, because after all, you'd want as many people as possible to see that you were hosting this great party with all these guests of honor. Now, straight away with our passage, we can wonder about the motive of Simon's invitation to Jesus, because as it says, he's a Pharisee. A few chapters before this verse, in Luke chapter 5, Luke tells us that the Pharisees considered Jesus to be blasphemous. They didn't like the fact that he was healing people, casting out demons, and going around claiming to forgive sins. And the Pharisees were a group of religious leaders. Some were teachers of the law. Others were simply self-appointed guardians of the law and its proper observance. In Luke chapter 6, verse 7, we see that the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. It's very clear that they're a hostile party towards Jesus, and they have a track record of constantly trying to catch him out on his knowledge of the law, or even better, catch him trying to break it. So we know a little bit more about Simon. It's time to introduce the next character in this story. So if you look at verse 37, a woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. So we're introduced to a woman from that town who we're told lived a sinful life. Now, we don't know any other information about this woman, but we do know from the way that Luke introduces her that she is known for her sin. The people of that town knew what she was like. They knew all about her, and when it came to who was worthy of being at this party, she would have been at the bottom of the pile. She is a stark contrast to the culture of appearing to be good and observing the law. So the scene is set. Are you ready for some drama? If you look with me at verse 38, as she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. Hushed silence falls over the crowd. And that brings us to our first point this evening, which is to see the scandalous gratitude. Well, the guests have stopped talking to each other. The people on the street have stopped to peer in through the windows and the doorways as they've noticed this commotion. The servants have stopped pouring the wine. No one can believe what they've seen. Why does the woman's actions cause such a shocked response from the onlookers? Well, because as we said before, this is a society that is deeply judgmental. And this sinful woman's mere presence causes controversy. But then she makes her way over to Jesus, the guest of honor, and she's crying, and she looks like a mess, and she's making a mess all over Jesus' feet with her tears. Then she lets down her hair and wipes Jesus' feet dry. And a woman's hair was her dignity in Jewish law. So this would have been disgraceful, to let your hair down at a party full of men. Make no mistake about it, this scene is an outrageous one. So why does the woman act in such a way that she knows is going to cause her to be the subject of contempt from the onlookers? Why would she humiliate herself like this? Well, because verse 37 tells us she learned that Jesus was there. Her attention is solely on him. She hears that Jesus is at this dinner party not too far away, so she makes her way there. She sees him reclined at the table. Somehow she gets into the party and she makes her way across the dining area and stands behind Jesus. And in that moment, she is filled with recognition and deep remorse for her sin. And in the presence of the one who she sinned against, she weeps. She knows where she is before God. She knows that she is in need of forgiveness. She humbles herself before him, using her hair to wipe Jesus' dirty, dusty, tear-covered feet. She anoints him with the perfume from the alabaster jars. That's all she can do. She just wants to show love and honor. She recognizes Jesus as someone who has the authority to forgive her for her sins. And she humbly kneels at his feet in respect and love and remorse and gratitude. Isn't that emotive? Isn't it humbling for us? Luke wants to move us with the intimacy of this moment. Luke wants us to be shocked by the realization that you cannot engage with God without intimacy, without wholehearted soul nakedness, just like the woman has. And that's why she doesn't care. That's why she doesn't care about the crowd. She knows that it's not image. She knows it's not reputation. It's not how closely she can observe the religious law that's going to save her. It's Jesus. Only Jesus. Her shocking actions show us she knows she is a sinner in need of forgiveness. She knows Jesus has the authority to forgive her, and she shows her great love to him for that. What she does is scandalous, but it is beautiful. So what about our other character? How does Simon the Pharisee react to the woman's actions? Well, let's look at verse 39. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. And that brings us to our second point, which is feel the rebuke by Jesus. Simon thinks this whole situation might have embarrassed Jesus or caught him out. He assumes that Jesus doesn't know that this woman is known to be a sinner. Maybe he was expecting Jesus to shoo her away. Simon takes this interaction between Jesus and the woman as proof that Jesus isn't a prophet, that he isn't from God. After all, the most religious people, those who are really right before God, the Pharisees, they would never associate with someone like this. How can this Jesus be holy when he's happy to be touched by someone who is known to be so wretched and so unclean? That's what Simon thinks. Simon doesn't see Jesus as the Son of God. He doesn't understand the power or the authority of the person that he's invited to his house for dinner. It's a total contrast to the woman's understanding of who Jesus is. Now notice that Simon the Pharisee doesn't say any of this out loud. He says it to himself. In verse 40 it says, Jesus answered him. He knew what Simon was thinking. Jesus could see Simon's judgmental heart just as clearly as he could see the woman's repentant one. It's not the first time that Jesus does this, by the way. He sees the hearts and the thoughts of the Pharisees and challenges them several times in the Gospels. I mean, how annoying must that have been? And so finally we arrive at the parable, which is sandwiched in the middle of this passage. And in some of the other parables we've looked at in this series, Jesus explains what they mean, either in the middle or at the end of the verses. But in this case, in our passage tonight, the parable is the explanation of what's happening in the rest of the verses. Let's read verses 41 to 43. 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One of them owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he cancelled the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon replied, "I suppose the one who had the bigger debt cancelled." "You have judged correctly," Jesus said. Well, the debt in this parable, it represents our sin, doesn't it? It represents our offence to God. Simon's response to Jesus' question shows us that he doesn't recognise his position as a sinner before God, in need of forgiveness. He doesn't see himself as one of those debtors. Simon, like the rest of the Pharisees, he thinks he's already right before God. After all, there was none who observed the law or even enforced the law like the Pharisees did. But they didn't do it out of love for God. In fact, they were hypocritical. They were self-righteous. Simon's attitude is that he's so much better than this woman, so much more righteous in God's eyes. And well, here's another shock for us. We're all like that in some way, aren't we? We might recognize our sin, but we all start off by thinking, well, not quite as bad as somebody else. It's the same for all of our society. It's built into us, the mentality of, yeah, but I'm not that bad. At least I'm better than that person. Even amongst prisoners, those who have been judged by society to be so bad that they should be separated from the rest, view themselves as better than other prisoners who've committed worse crimes than them. If you go to prison for certain crimes, you're condemned by your fellow inmates. I'm not as bad as that person is a default mentality that we all have. And that's the purpose of Jesus' parable. It's to remind us that whatever our debt, we can't pay it back. It's not about the amount. It's about the fact that we're all in debt and all of us need that debt to be forgiven. And this goes against everything that religious law tells Simon and everybody else in the Jewish culture at the time. It's scandalous that Jesus is telling them that they are in the same place before God as this sinful woman. Simon just doesn't recognize it, does he? Just like the woman, we see Simon's heart towards God in the way that he treats Jesus. He doesn't think that Jesus is worthy of that respect or love. He doesn't seek that intimacy that the woman does. Let's look at verses 44 on to 47. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little, loves little." And Jesus is reinforcing the parable, isn't he? Jesus rebukes Simon for showing him no hospitality, for showing him no respect, no love. And in verse 47, Jesus makes the contrast between our two main characters crystal clear. Jesus says the woman's sins have been forgiven, and that her forgiveness is shown in her literal outpouring of love towards Jesus. Whereas because Simon doesn't feel that he is a fellow debtor, because he doesn't see his sin as a problem, he loves little. So we've seen two contrasting attitudes towards Jesus. And maybe like me, when I prepared this talk this week, you can see a bit of your heart in each of those responses. So we're going to discuss, there's going to be a question on the screen in a moment. We're going to have 5 minutes to discuss that around our tables, and then we'll come back together and see how the story plays out.
Yeah.
Well, guys, sorry to cut your discussion short. I'm sure you can continue them after the service. But I think we all want to know how the story ends. Well, our third and final point tonight is receive forgiveness through faith. So let's see what plays out over those last couple of verses. Let's look again at verses 48 to 50. Then Jesus said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." The other guests began to say among themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" Jesus said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." Jesus says, "Your faith has saved you." This is really important because it would be easy for us to think that it's the woman's actions towards Jesus that have led to her forgiveness and to her being saved from her debt. But Jesus says, "Your faith has saved you." Her trust in Jesus as having the authority to forgive her sin came before her outpouring of love for him. Her actions were a result of her great love, which she has because she knows she's been forgiven. Her redemption comes from her faith. She receives forgiveness through faith. Can you imagine what must have gone through her mind when she heard those words? The weight of sin that's been over her whole life, so much so that it literally defines her among society. That weight is lifted. And as the sweet smell of her perfume penetrates the evening air, the love of Jesus Christ penetrates the heart of the sinner who has put their faith in him and who has received forgiveness. And if you're listening to this and you think you're too sinful, too broken, too far gone, just like I once thought, well, you can know that whatever your past, whatever the life you've lived, however much debt you are in with Jesus, these verses tell us that he has the authority to speak your sin forgiven. This continues our theme of shock and outrage because it's the sinful woman who is forgiven at the end of this story, not the Pharisee. Jesus is smashing through the cultural perception that observing the religious law and having a high status through self-righteous virtue signaling is enough to be forgiven. And Jesus is saying, it's me. That's how you're forgiven. Through faith in Jesus and Jesus only. And the crowd say in verse 49, "Who is this that he can even forgive sins?" Well, Jesus is making it really clear, isn't he? He's telling everyone at that party, and he's telling us here tonight that he is God. He has the authority to forgive sin because he is God. And so how does this apply to us that are already Christians? Why do we need to hear this? Well, sometimes the perception of Christians or the stereotype is that Christians think they're better than everyone else, or that we're judgy and self-righteous, and maybe sometimes that's true. But being a Christian is about knowing that we're in as much need of being forgiven as everybody else is. And so for us, it's so important that we recognize where we are before God tonight, and that we recognize that we're sinners who can't work off our debt. And it is only our soul nakedness before Jesus and our faith in him that leads to forgiveness. Maybe there are people here tonight who are not forgiven. Maybe you haven't put your faith in Jesus to forgive you. Well, in verse 50, Jesus says to the woman, "Go in peace." And for those of us who know Jesus personally and who have put faith in him, that through his death on the cross, our sin is forgiven and our debt is cancelled, then we can go in peace tonight. Even I, the most wretched and prolific sinner in this room, I'll go through those doors tonight in peace because I'm forgiven. The peace meaning that we're no longer God's enemies but his children, that we're no longer hiding in sin but that our souls are exposed and our arms are wide open before him, that we're no longer condemned but forgiven. That's peace. And how do we respond to that? Well, we can either treat Jesus like Simon did or like the woman did. Will you invite him in but then keep him at a distance? Or will you fall on your knees before him and kiss his feet? Will you seek that intimacy with him? Will you seek to draw closer to him this week? I'm going to hand back over to Josie.